first impulse is to run. And when there's no place left to run, pray. Pray like there's no tomorrow. Because for the people dying all around you, tomorrow will never come. No one knows where to hide, how to save themselves, how to survive. Bodies beyond number. A firestorm of violence and madness. The terrible vengeance of God. It is the Black Death of the Middle Ages. The greatest biological disaster in the history of mankind. It is, as one witness testifies, the end of the world. At the dawn of the 14th century, Western civilization is riding a phenomenal streak of prosperity.
Europe has had 3, maybe 4 centuries of really good times. The church has been strong, various kingdoms have been strong, trade has grown, cities have grown, industry has grown, there haven't been any natural catastrophes, weather's been nice, population's been growing. It's really been a nice time for Europe.
But this long expansion is about to collide with a new reality. Suddenly, global climate patterns shift. Temperatures plummet and crops fail. With startling swiftness, the Golden Age collapses and visions of the apocalypse come true.
The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse have come. Famine hits, plague hits, war is all over, and death is all over.
By the 1340s, war ravages the continent. The deepening crisis hits peasants hard. But nobles see an opportunity to make their fortune in the escalating chaos. At 33, Edward III of England is a seasoned ruler, and his island kingdom is not big enough to contain his ambition. In August of 1347, Edward's army wins an improbable victory at Calais over his much wealthier rival, Philip VI of France. Edward now controls much of the French seacoast, but the conflict is far from over.
This is the beginning of the 100 Years' War, and which is really a world war as far as the Europeans are concerned. It involves everywhere: Spain, Germany, Italy, France, England.
King Edward promises his daughter Joan to Pedro, the Prince of Spanish Castile. It is a match meant to extend his reach as far as the Iberian Peninsula. For a marriage between the 2 royal families will redraw the map of Europe and make Edward's line the mightiest in Christendom. Barely 15, Joan has never met her fiancé, nor has she ever been to Spain. Like any young girl, Joan dares to hope her father has chosen a handsome prince, perhaps even a kind one. "400 miles to the south, in Avignon, France, Pope Clement VI, God's representative on earth, considers his own prospects. For 1,000 years, his Holy Catholic Church has lorded over king and peasant alike, the greatest power in the Middle Ages.
The religion of a medieval person was their life. It surrounded them. They thought nothing of going to church every day. Their life consisted of a lot of blessings, which they attributed to God, and cursings, which they kind of attributed to God too, although they blamed it on their sins. So their whole life was enveloped in this religious atmosphere.
But in the 14th century, the church's seemingly impregnable facade begins to crack.
Priests were coming under a lot of criticism. for abusing their power. We have lots of examples of priests who had concubines, priests who slept with women in the village, priests who were considered corrupt.
Even the Pope seems tainted. The French have hijacked the papacy, moving it from Rome to Avignon. The break with tradition seems to suit Clement VI, a worldly man who enjoys his opulent lifestyle, but it scandalizes the faithful. Despite the skeptics, Clement's word still carries absolute authority. But will it be enough to sustain his flock when the world comes crashing in?
Questo è un messaggio urgente per il chirurgo. Sì.
The one man who will prove to be his most trusted and courageous advisor is his personal physician, Guy de Chauliac.
He's the medical practitioner of great renown. He had been in court medical circles since the reign of Philip the Fair around the turn of the 14th century, and now he is the attending physician, so to speak, of the Pope.
In de Chauliac's world, religion rules science. So entwined are the two that a medical degree can only be earned with a master's degree in theology as well. But neither his medical texts nor his Bible will prepare de Chauliac for the horror to come. Far to the east, on the Mongolian steppes, something terrible has awakened. An invisible agent of death. Rumors fly that all of humanity is being wiped out in China, India, and the Islamic world.
Interestingly enough, these rumors of origins in the East are accompanied by apocalyptic descriptions of the plague's origins. There were miraculous events that occurred, a rain of frogs, serpents, and so forth. There was a rain of hail and thunder and lightning, and then finally stinking smoke and thunder fell from the heavens.
Before 1347, the Mongols seem unstoppable. Their dominion over the East has lasted nearly 150 years in an empire stretching from the peaks of Tibet to beyond the Volga River, and from Beijing to Constantinople.
Essentially, they opened up trade between Western Europe and China. People could essentially follow routes that went through Central Asia, so that the second half of the 13th century in particular was a time for expansion of European trade toward the east.
But as the Mongols make the world a better place for business, they also plant the seeds of its destruction.
We have very valuable goods and cargo, such as spices and silk, passing along this overland route opened up by the Mongols through their unified empire. But of course, another commodity would have been plague.
Relentlessly, the pestilence creeps across the steppes, wiping out whole villages, the bodies swollen with malignant sores. In this harsh wilderness, nothing goes to waste. Valuable goods like furs and blankets are always salvaged. The rest is torched, an attempt to kill the evil that caused this tragedy. But the unseen demon travels with the loot. In 1347, thousands of miles to the west in the bustling trade city of Geneva, a servant prepares to make a dangerous journey. In a society defined by the doctrines of the Christian Church, he is already at risk. His name is Agamet, and he is a Jew.
Jews had to have the explicit invitation and permission of the king to be in a town. They were, in a way that no other medieval person was, owned and directly dependent upon the king or a great noble like a bishop.
At his lord's bidding, Agamot will venture hundreds of mountainous miles to Venice, where he can purchase luxuries which are unavailable in the common market stalls of his home. But his expedition also takes him into the darkest events of history. In England, a rider is approaching the end of another daunting journey. A troubadour, he has traveled for weeks, all the way from Spain. He is a gift from the Prince of Castile, sent to amuse his betrothed, the English Princess Joan. He will sing her songs of love on her wedding voyage to Castile, a romantic gesture for the pleasure of a young girl. On the way to Castile, Joan and her entourage plan to stop on the French coast and visit their estate in Bordeaux. A favorite among the 12 children born to her father, Edward III, Joan has lacked for little in her short life. On this momentous voyage, her dresses alone require an entire ship. Along with many distinguished clergymen and diplomats, 100 bowmen will make the journey to protect this precious cargo. But their precautions will come to nothing. Within a year, almost all of them will be dead. Even now, the invasion has begun, carried on the lowly backs of small stowaways. A ticking bomb, it will bring this beautiful world crashing down. Trade routes opened by the Mongol Empire now encourage the spread of goods, people, and pestilence into the heart of Europe. Travelers on the road, peasants in the field, and even the daughter of the King of England are all speeding towards an inevitable encounter with the greatest killer in the history of mankind, the Black Death. At the end of the Mongol trade routes lies the port city of Kaffa on the Black Sea, starting point for merchant ships en route to Italy. In 1347, the Mongols attacked the Christian city of Kaffa, hoping to take this vital trade link for themselves. At first, it seems as if the town will fall to the relentless assault. But in the heat of hostilities, the Mongols suddenly confront a virulent new enemy, plague. It inspires them to launch a final desperate plan.
The Mongols got the plague and had to call off the siege. But before they left, they decided to catapult their dead corpses, the dead bodies of their victims, into the town in order to, quote, extinguish everyone inside and give the plague to their enemies. And apparently this is how the plague was communicated by the Mongols to Europeans.
It just may be the first incident of germ warfare in recorded history. While the story might be more legend than fact, the Mongol pestilence spreads to the townspeople of Kaffa.
The plague is fairly slow-moving for an epidemic disease. In 15 years, given the vast stretches of the steppe and the thinness of the population, would be about the right time to get it to Kaffa.
But while these facts seem clear, a mystery remains. After such a slow beginning, how does the plague spread to Europe so fast? Many historians believe it hitches a ride on merchant boats bound for Europe, and its first port of call is the island of Sicily. To the people of the shore and inlets of Italy, The waves have always delivered up the odds and ends of the Mediterranean storms. But this year, something different washes ashore.
Ah! Oh mio Dio! Andiamocene via! Andiamocene!
Aspettami, aspettami!
And in the towns, ships from the Black Sea sail into harbor, bearing something foul. Below decks, the Italians find a cargo of corpses. The few survivors are reported to have sickness clinging to their very bones.
Mio Dio, che male è questo?
When the townspeople realize the danger, they try to banish the plague ships from their harbor, but it is too late. The plague has already taken hold, and the dying begins. This is no ordinary illness. It is disgusting and painful. Its victims fall into terrible fever and dark despair.
Initially, it would have been difficult to tell the early symptoms of Black Death from a very heavy flu-like, what we would consider to be flu-like symptoms, and fevers, chills, and a high temperature. And then there would be a second stage where there would be development of the welts, the swelling of the buboes.
The bubo is a painfully enlarged lymph gland in the neck or groin. They become black and can swell to the size of an orange. It is these buboes that suggest bubonic plague may be the cause of the Black Death.
It's spread can be very, very rapid. It can cause septic shock. Your blood pressure will drop very rapidly. See multi-organ failure. The vascular system can become leaky and you can have hemorrhaging. The buboes themselves are very, very painful. It's a very awful way to die.
Like pioneers in death, the people of the Sicilian town of Messina soon discover that this new disease is not only awful, but also highly contagious. It quickly spreads within families, sowing terror in every quarter.
This more or less struck out of the blue, and nobody had seen anything like this. So these people were like, they were like Columbus in the land of mass death. That's just what they were like.
As the plague rages through the Sicilian town of Messina, the survivors have only one place to turn: the Holy Mother of God. Those still able to walk trek to her shrine 6 miles away and carry her back to the city.
Santa Madre, proteggici da questa malattia in nome di Cristo.
Despite their urgent pleas, the Virgin refuses to help them, according to the Italian chronicler Michele di Piazza.
The arrival of the statue profited nobody. The Messinese were so loathed and feared that no man would speak to them or be in their company, but hastily fled at the sight of them, holding his breath.
The visibility of the disease, it marks an individual out as having that disease, and that's very important in terms of creating a social stigma.
Though the Sicilians shun their Messinese neighbors, they cannot outrun the disease. The mark of sickness leaps across the island with startling speed, and the horror has just begun. Already other Genoese ships from Caffa are landing on the Italian mainland. They bear furs, textiles, and rats, all fine purveyors of death. Like an avenging angel, the plague will sweep across an unsuspecting continent as the apocalypse begins. now faces the greatest threat ever known to mankind. Swift and deadly, it seems to come from nowhere and everywhere. As it reaches Italian shores, people are utterly defenseless. For medieval science is mired in a fog of superstition and ignorance. Guy de Chauliac is surgeon to Philip VI, King of France, as well as Pope Clement VI, who resides in Avignon, France. Renowned for his great intellect, he has been trained by the best physicians in Europe at the monastery in Montpellier. His techniques, like bleeding with leeches, are all designed to restore balance to the body.
There actually were medical theories about the balances of elements, about what kind of balance the body needs in order to stay healthy. And the plague, from a medical point of view, was seen above all as a reversal of all the normal balances.
Conveniently, an unusual alignment of planets directly precedes the outbreak. To the medieval mind, it is a logical explanation for the imbalance.
The conjunction of the three planets, Jupiter, Mars and Saturn, that created noxious vapors within the air. And it was these noxious vapors that interacted with the individual constitution that caused somebody to succumb to the plague.
This was the miasmatic explanation, or that the plague came from a miasma, an evil vapor. And I should emphasize that these explanations were not new. They were very old.
And so entrenched that it is almost impossible for the medical community to depart from this way of thinking. Away from the elite power centers of Avignon and Paris, in merchant towns like Geneva or Venice, common people have less elaborate theories about the source of the plague. They've been indoctrinated since birth to believe that, like all blessings, curses all ultimately flow from God.
In the Middle Ages, the entire logic of the relationship between God and the world involved God's punishing the world when the world sinned.
Punishment is well deserved, according to 14th century Italian chronicler Gabriele de Mussis.
Almighty God saw the entire human race wallowing in the mire of manifold wickedness, enmeshed in a wrongdoing, pursuing numberless vices, drowning in a sea of depravity because of a limitless capacity for evil.
We now know that it was not sin or evil that brought on the Black Death. It was a contagious disease. The question is, which disease? 600 years later, historians and scientists are still looking for an answer.
What the key question becomes is how those diseases become transmitted and propagated, and what is it in society that enables a set of different causes of death to emerge at one point in time.
For more than a century, the main theory has been that the Black Death was caused by bubonic plague, caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It is carried by fleas and requires a very particular environment to flourish. In many ways, medieval Europe seems to fit the bill.
Urban centers, garbage on the streets, tremendous milieu in which to breed huge rat populations. And with those huge rat populations, huge flea populations.
A single flea bite injects the victim with Yersinia pestis bacteria. They quickly multiply in the lymph nodes, filling them to bursting. Once released into the bloodstream, the bacteria causes the black welts that give the Black Plague its name. And there is another, even deadlier form of the disease, called pneumonic plague. It needs no flea to spread its poison.
In some instances, the bacteria will go to the lungs and lodge there and begin to proliferate. If you cough and you have also hemorrhaging in the lungs from the bacteria, you can get what's called a bloody sputum, where your spit has blood, flecks of blood in it. And if you're coughing, those respiratory droplets can be quite infectious, and then you can infect another person.
Both the environmental conditions and disease symptoms suggest bubonic plague was the cause of the Black Death. But some scientists vigorously disagree with this theory. They point to one inexplicable and compelling fact: the shocking speed with which the disease spread.
Basically spread across Europe, Western Europe, within 4 or 5 years. It's incredibly rapid spread, considering that they didn't have trains, planes, automobiles, that the transportation was by foot or by horseback. I mean, it's a very, very rapid spread of the disease.
Many doubt bubonic plague could travel so fast.
The speed at which the disease spread around communities isn't consistent with what we know about bubonic plague. So this has led some historians to suggest that perhaps there was another causal mechanism involved, there was another epidemic disease involved. Perhaps one suggestion has been the spread of anthrax. Other authors have suggested it might have been an Ebola-like virus. There are clear differences here in relation to the way in which disease is spread.
Why does knowing the truth about a disease that happened centuries ago concern us today? Quite simply, understanding the Black Death could be critical in our fight against mankind's next catastrophic outbreak. But until recently, it has seemed that the clues to this mystery died with the plague victims. Or have they? In Montpellier, France, a 650-year-old mass grave is giving modern technology the chance to pick up the scent once more. A contemporary team of French researchers exhumes the bodies of plague victims, breaking new ground in a new scientific frontier.
Black Death studies are still young. It used to be thought Black Death couldn't get anything out of a skeleton. It was a tissue disease. All we have are the bones. Couldn't get anything from it. Now with DNA, with some of the other things that we can get out of bones, there's some possibilities. It's still very, very controversial, but there's some possibilities that we might learn more and more.
The researchers are mining for biological treasure, the teeth of plague victims. Like a locked box, a tooth seals in the DNA of organisms traveling in the bloodstream at the time of death, including, perhaps, the very agent of death.
On a trouvé quelque chose, je crois que c'est important. Les dents sont entières.
They took the teeth out of the skulls. Then they examined the tooth pulp for evidence of the presence of the plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis. And according to their results, these sequences were obviously Yersinia pestis DNA, but they were somewhat unique. And it provided the only really objective evidence that we have that the Black Death might indeed have been caused by Yersinia pestis.
The French results bring the mystery of the plague one step closer to its solution. But more study must be done, more graves investigated. The scientists' work will continue. To Guy de Chauliac, eminent 14th century physician, the concepts of deadly fleas and bacterial DNA would sound as unlikely as ill-crossed stars and God's wrath sound to us today. Yet all he has are his charts of the stars and his own quick wits to battle the greatest peril the human race has ever known. By the autumn, the Black Death has made its way from the Far East and is sweeping over Sicily, leaving panic in its wake. It is a disaster without precedence, as if God himself has deserted his children. In Venice, Agamot, the Jewish servant of a Swiss lord, finds all that his master desires: saffron and cinnamon, silks and furs, and more besides. For late in the year, merchant ships from the east arrive bearing a cargo of death. 14th century Italian chronicler Gabriele de Mussis gives voice to the horror of the sailors who have unwittingly brought the eastern catastrophe home.
To our anguish, we were carrying the darts of death. We were spreading a poison from our lips even as we spoke.
Of course, they didn't have any idea that the plague was spread by a bacterium, by a microscopic organism that can't be seen by the naked eye. But they did have a sense and a knowledge that the plague could be spread from person to person.
As Agamot heads back to Geneva, the world behind him begins to fall apart. Venetians are dying at the astonishing rate of 600 a day. In January of 1348, the plague enters France through ships trading at Marseille. It sails over water to Spain. In Barcelona, 60% of the population perishes.
You could imagine a person, let's say a sailor, working in the dock area, being bitten by an infectious flea. They would get on their ship, and then they could travel on their ship. And they wouldn't become sick for, again, 2 to 6 days. So there's the potential for people to move around, move from one area to another before becoming ill. Of course, this same ship may have rats with infectious rat fleas, and then when the ship reaches a port, those rats and their fleas can get off and spread the disease as well.
By early spring, the Black Death travels up to the mouth of the Rhone River to Avignon, where the Pope resides.
Vignerin, je vous en supplie. La maladie frappe à la porte.
Doctor, noter per mio protegere.
Though Guy de Chauliac urges him to flee, Clement VI reportedly refuses to leave his palace. By August 1348, the plague reaches Paris. Half its population will die. When it lands in Bordeaux, England's Princess Joan is just arriving from her sea journey. She will rest at the family estate for a while and then continue on to Castile and her prince. Joan is perhaps the most well-guarded woman in Europe right now, but archers and castle walls cannot shield her from an unseen enemy.
Non, non, non! Vous ne pouvez pas passer ici! Non! C'est trop dangereux pour la princesse!
Like a phantom, the pestilence strikes randomly, wiping out a household, a neighborhood, an entire town. Even before it sows destruction, it breeds terror.
There was nothing they could do. And it's that sense of facing an event over which you have absolutely no power that makes it such a dramatic event in human history.
I've often tried to imagine what it must have felt like to hear that in the town across the mountains, 75% of the people had just died. And they did hear, they received letters before the plague came. They knew the plague was coming in many places. So they had time to think about what's going to happen when it gets here. And I can't really imagine a scarier thought.
Consumed by fear, many of the gentry flee the cities, leaving the less fortunate to fend for themselves.
What we see in literature are these cowardly figures, the rich who are going into the countryside and who are there frightened by their own mortality. So who's left behind? Who is back in town suffering but the poor and those who are unable to do what the rich can?
In England, Edward III and his eldest son retreat to a country estate, bolting the gates behind them. But the wholesome atmosphere does not seem to protect the serfs who farm the land. They die by the droves. In the fields, on the roads, and in their miserable hovels.
People lived in extreme poverty, and they lived in huts with thatched roofs. They had livestock living in very close association with them. They had dirt floors to the huts. The living conditions were absolutely filthy. The types of environments where you'd expect rats and rat fleas to proliferate and do quite well.
As conditions worsen, the church too seems to fail its flock. Fearing contamination, some priests refuse to administer last rites to the dead.
Padre, mia moglie e la piccola Anna Maria hanno bisogno di lei. Lei stesso l'ha battezzata.
For medieval people, to die without last rites is a more terrifying prospect than death itself. But as the death toll mounts and more priests succumb to the plague, the Bishop of Bath makes a startling suggestion.
If they are on the point of death and cannot secure the services of a priest, then they should make confession to each other, to a layman, or, if no man is present, even to a woman.
In these grim days, self-preservation usually wins out over heroism. Not even family ties can bind the healthy to the sick, as one of the great writers of the age, Giovanni Boccaccio, witnesses.
Relatives were cared for, not otherwise than dogs. They threw them their food and drink by the bed, and then they fled the household.
One person would get sick first, the family might start to take care of them, maybe friends would come and help, but then others in the family would get sick, and you can imagine that very quickly people would abandon any attempt to help each other.
When you have every third person dying, this of course is going to affect people's outlook and mentality. One of the responses would be fear. Am I going to be next? Is the plague going to strike me? Can I get the plague even from my father, my brother, my sister?
The lack of compassion appalls Sienese chronicler Agnolo de Tora.
Father abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother, another. For this illness seemed to strike through breath and sight. And so they died.
The death rates were so high that basically people's faith was shocked or rocked to the core. Many of the teachings they'd been given by the church didn't seem to give them any comfort or seem to be applicable to the situation. Everyone was dying. It didn't seem to make any sense.
The very fabric of society is unraveling, and no one seems to know how to weave it back together.
This was God's vengeance on humans for their wickedness and sin. What better way to respond to that than by an extraordinary penance that would take away that sin?
And so, in their terror, the people turn to religious zealots who whip themselves in a brutal imitation of Christ's own suffering. Their fanaticism will lead the crowds further into hysteria, persecution, and mass murder. By 1348, the Black Death has traveled from Sicily to England, carried in trade ships aboard the backs of rats. Already it has claimed the lives of millions. In every village, in every farm, the corpses pile up in staggering numbers, creating a new crisis: how to dispose of the dead.
If you lose 10% of 95,000 people, think about that. That's 10,000 people. How do you bury 10,000 people that have been lost in a very short period of time? Where do you find the people to take them? Where do you find the people where do you find the carts to take them?
The only people who were willing to carry away the dead were these very rustic, uncouth men or women who came down from the mountains or from the surrounding countryside, who were willing for very high fees to take away the dead and have contact with the dead.
The smells must have been very difficult, and people tried to accommodate that by having fires and, having sweet smells around. They tried to cover up the smell of death. But you can only go so far with that.
In 1349, graves must be found for nearly 300 people a day in London. The situation is even worse in Avignon. In one 6-week period, 11,000 people are buried in a single graveyard. The Pope is finally driven to consecrate the Rhone River. Countless bodies are committed to a watery, unmarked grave. But perhaps even that is preferable to an Italian mass burial.
They were layered like layers of a lasagna. They would put the bottom layer, sprinkle a little dirt, a second layer, sprinkle a little dirt, third layer, sprinkle dirt.
In Siena, in the Tuscany region of Italy, the toll is literally unbearable. Fully half the population is reported dead. Siena citizen Agnolo de Tora raises a lament that has lost none of its poignancy after 6.5 centuries.
In many places, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of the dead. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. I, Agnolo di Tora, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world.
In spite of the personal risk, some brave hearts hold fast, combating the mounting crisis. Many doctors have stopped seeing patients to save themselves. Not Guy de Chauliac.
He stayed. I think there was not just bravery, but a certain scientific curiosity there. He wanted to see what this great blazing demon was and how it worked.
Guy de Chauliac seems to do what a more modern medical practitioner would do, which is he doesn't understand the disease, so he takes part in helping individuals with the disease until he gets it, and then he writes about it.
In his remarkable journal, the careful surgeon catalogues all the symptoms of the disease while making note of which treatments seem to be most effective. In the summer of 1348, Guy de Chauliac is said to have prescribed fire itself as a preventative for Pope Clement VI. 4 great basins of oil and wood are set ablaze on either side of the Pope's throne, a fortress of flames against the ravages of the plague.
It gives us this image of the Pope running from society, so to speak, sequestered in an interior room that is now blazing hot with fires build up around him. Clemens formed his own hell, if you will, in order to keep out of plague's reach.
And if your dominant medical theory of disease causation is the miasmas and the bad vapours in the air, then if the smoke given off by the fire has a purifying effect, then clearly that makes some sort of sense in terms of warding off infection.
whether by fire or luck, the Pope survives the plague. But Princess Joan, the favorite daughter of the King of England, does not. Like almost half the population of Europe, she falls victim to the Black Death. Her father, Edward III, is powerless to do anything but mourn.
Destructive death, who seizes young and old alike, has lamentably snatched from us our dearest daughter, whom we loved best of all.
All the trappings of authority have just disappeared, and you see one human being, one grieving human being, and he's speaking to another person, and it's a voice that's immediately recognizable 700 years later, despite the trappings of authority.
All authority, medics, clerics, nobles, fail. And so the masses turn elsewhere for salvation. Along the Rhine region of Germany, the faithful decide to take matters into their own hands. They are known as the Flagellants. Fanatics who think they can win God's mercy by imitating Christ's bloody passion. Theirs is an extreme measure for an extreme time, and people flock to them in droves.
People looked upon the Flagellants as helping to ward off the disease, as perhaps their extraordinary penance might avert God's wrath and take away the plague.
The notion of flagellating oneself might have a particular appeal, a very dramatic method of, painful, dramatic method of scourging oneself of the sins in the expectation that you might not be alive tomorrow.
In groups as large as 1,000 men, the Flagellants commit themselves to a master for 33.5 days to mark their Savior's years on earth. Forsaking bath, bed, and sex, they piously march from city to city, performing gruesome masochistic acts before appreciative throngs. In his journals, the French chronicler Jean d'Yvennet writes,
"The penitents scourged themselves with whips of hard-knotted leather with little iron spikes. Some made themselves bleed very badly between the shoulder blades, and some foolish women had clothes ready to catch the blood and smear it on their eyes, saying it was miraculous blood."
Pope Clement VI, however, feels threatened by their growing influence.
The Flagellants were suspected by the organized religious establishment. Their coming to a place often created a lot of commotion, and sometimes it was accompanied by even movements against the town authorities or other groups. Religious reform, too.
As the plague progressed, one senses that all the institutions in medieval society, including most notably the church, were shown to be the plague showed them to be as powerless as, they were just like everyone else, as the poorest peasant.
This juggernaut will be hard to stop. The medieval masses are ready for a miracle, and the Flagellants seem ready to deliver.
That's what the flagellant processions and the sermons that attended them created. This moment of heightened, messianic, apocalyptic, now is the time expectation.
In 1348, a maelstrom of hate more vicious than even the Black Death itself erupts. Shock gives way to a witch hunt. Someone must be responsible for this catastrophe, and they should pay. In a torrent of hysteria and fear, the crowds target the helpless and innocent in a bloodbath of biblical proportions. In the mid-1300s, the Black Death is rushing toward its apex. Already it has cut a path of destruction from Sicily to England. Convinced that God is punishing the world for its wickedness, the towns set out to purge themselves of all forms of sin.
The first thing they would do is pass urban reform ordinances. No gambling, no swearing, put the prostitutes out in a house in the countryside, clean up your act. Maybe that will avert the plague.
Bene, bene, bene. Questo non deve succedere mai più.
E voi, seguiteci. Per voi e per le ragazze è tempo di prendere una vacanza.
In many towns, like Pistoia, Italy, town fathers combat the plague with new laws, changing the treatment of the dead.
Ordinanza numero 3. I cadaveri non potranno essere rimossi dal luogo della morte prima che vengano chiusi in una cassa di legno. Ordinanza numero 5. Che nessuno abbia l'ardire di portare cadaveri all'interno della città. Ordinanza numero 30. Durante i funerali le campane non potranno essere più suonate.
The tolling of the funeral bell, once a comforting sound to mark the passing of a loved one, has become an incessant reminder of a world gone to hell.
There were so many people dying that you might have, a priest might be leading one procession, a procession of one person to a grave, and then he would look behind him and he would see 10 more that he would have to accompany to their grave. So there was a mass death, so much death, in fact, that people, in a sense, became inured to it or hardened to it, that now funerals became the occasion of witticisms and jollification.
But in Germany, the escalating death toll brings out something even worse in people. The extreme violence of the flagellant movement. Their violent self-punishment, complete with the suggestion of holy blood, creates a sensation as they travel through a countryside empty of hope. Their dramatic displays are far more compelling than the ineffectual mutterings of the village priest. The flagellants focus the people's fear and rage on a tangible target, the local church. Believing their bloody sacrifice earns them God's grace, flagellants claim to perform Christ-like miracles.
Some flagellants believed that dead babies or dead children could be revived in their midst. There's also a famous story of a cow talking as a miracle ascribed to the flagellants.
Along the Rhine, it seems as if miracles are being performed. While in Avignon, France, the very heart of Christendom, 400 people are dying a day. Pope Clement VI knows the flagellants pose a dangerous threat to his authority, but his cardinals urge him not to do anything hasty. They fear an attack on the movement at the peak of its popularity could cause a backlash against the church itself.
There's an interesting dynamic between the popular attitude towards the flagellants and the authorities' attitude towards the flagellants. The authorities tended to take a hostile stance, but the people, on the other hand, seemed to have supported the flagellants, largely because they associated their arrival with a warding off or averting of the plague.
Clement can do nothing to quell the insurgency. And the movement is about to take its ugliest turn.
These processions could be experienced by ordinary people, ordinary Christians, as a totally transformative moral experience that uplifts them and that makes them feel that they have the strength and the energy to make their city or their town a better place, whatever that takes. It may take swearing that you'll never gamble again. It may take throwing the prostitutes out of the city. It may take expelling the Jews or even burning them.
The Jewish merchant Agamet has traveled through hundreds of miles, devastated by the plague. But ahead of him waits a greater horror, a bloodbath of epic proportions.
It's human nature, I suppose, to look for a scapegoat in times of crisis. Jews always seem to be the scapegoat, and in the Black Death they were as well.
For the flagellants, it is an easy leap from criticizing the church to attacking the Jews. For to medieval Christians, no one offends God more.
There is a whole history of blood libels against the Jews, a whole history of persecution of the Jews by Christians during the Middle Ages.
Betrayed by his distinctive clothing which marks him as a Jew, Agamet is taken to town officials for questioning. He is not alone, according to 14th century chronicler Jean de Venette.
The infection and the sudden death which it brought were blamed on the Jews, who were said to have poisoned wells and rivers and corrupted the air.
War ein Beutel, den dir der Rabbiner gegeben hat. Was war denn eigentlich im Beutel drin?
Ich habe keinen
Lügner.
Von keinem bekommen.
Lügner.
Keinen.
Du hast Flüsse vergiftet, nicht wahr?
Ich schwöre.
Lügner. Lügner.
After hours of torture, Agamet breaks down. He falsely confesses that a rabbi did give him a pouch filled with venom, which he used to poison the wells.
They were forced to confess that no Jews are innocent. All Jews are guilty. They're all part of this conspiracy. No one can be cleared of these charges.
De Venette reports that confessions like Agamet's fly up and down the Rhine.
Accordingly, the whole world brutally rose against them. And in Jewish communities, many thousands were indiscriminately butchered, slaughtered, and burnt alive by the Christians.
What's poisoning us is the Jews' presence itself. That the Jews' presence is a moral failing. It's our sin to tolerate them, and this is what's bringing this punishment.
As Pope Clement VI pointed out at the time, Jews were dying in equal number to Christians, so it was fantastical to argue that Jews were poisoning people during the Black Death.
The Pope's pleas fall on deaf ears. On St. Valentine's Day, 1349, the citizens of Strasbourg round up as many as 2,000 Jews and burn them at the stake. The atrocity is repeated in more than 15 cities in Germany and Switzerland. The people of Europe have been poisoned, not by some insidious Jewish plot, but by fear, hate, and ignorance. The lethal combination is spinning out of control, even faster than the Black Death. In the winter of 1349, Christians in Germany, France, and Switzerland turn on their Jewish neighbors in a horrific massacre intended to appease an angry God. But violence cannot stop the grim progress of the Black Death. In Avignon, nearly all of the nobles have fled the city. Even the Pope retreats to his country estate, no longer trusting in his protective wall of fire. Only one member of his court stays behind, the renowned physician Guy de Chauliac. But the aging surgeon's final investigation of the disease comes perilously close to home.
Guy de Chauliac continued to make the rounds during the plague in Avignon, to the point where he himself came down with the illness.
And even on his deathbed, he doesn't quite know what it is that we've got. But he's willing to help people. He's willing to try.
De Chauliac's heroic commitment to his patients has brought him to the brink of death. No one knows better than he how slim his chances of recovery are. As the heroic doctor struggles for his life in France, the flagellant movement in Germany starts to fall apart. Originally made up of pious zealots, the flagellants now attract outlaws. They greedily hoard loot stolen from the churches and openly consort with rowdy women.
One gets the sense from some of these stories that in some of these villages, the flagellants were almost treated like rock stars, and that there might be what would be after flagellant parties. The sight of the blood, the stripped down bodies and the sweat and the lean muscular frames and all of that, no doubt aroused many young female peasant hearts. That and the fact that you just had so much emotion loose at that moment in time.
It is simply too much. The authorities finally move against them. In October 1349, Pope Clement VI calls for the flagellants to disperse and is roundly ignored.
The church actually has to look to the political means of stopping the flagellants. The flagellants begin to be arrested or they begin to be chased away by military officials.
Some masters, now called Masters of Errors, are even seized and beheaded.
Wir befinden dich für schuldig. Du hast Unglauben verbreitet. Du bist zum Tode verurteilt. Soll Gott deine Seele schützen.
Even with the flagellant movement broken, much of Europe remains violently hostile to the sadly diminished Jewish community. The survivors become refugees, searching for a safe haven.
In most of Europe, France, England, large parts, many German cities, had no Jews by the end of the 14th century. They'd expelled them or killed them. But in some places, Jews were being given greater protection by monarchs and invited to settle, and one of those places is Poland.
In 1349, Poland is ruled by King Casimir the Great.
The legends are that he fell in love with a Jewish woman called Esther, and it was out of love for her that he issued this bull of protection to the Jews of Poland and invited more Jews into Poland.
One of the ironies is it pushed the German Jewish community toward Poland. And 700 years later, that sort of came full circle again with the same group of Germans.
In the winter of 1349, the plague pushes north to the Scandinavian peninsula. By the time it reaches Russia, 2 years later, the crisis is over in France. After wiping out almost half the population of Europe, the plague itself is sputtering to an end.
Infectious diseases have these natural cycles that they go through until that cycle is broken, either by human agency or by, for example, a change in virulence of the infective organism itself.
As the Black Death proceeded and as the humans began to die and society, that it was falling apart basically, it's possible that the human numbers drop down below a certain level and that these outbreaks can't maintain themselves.
The magnitude of the final death toll is so vast that it strains the human imagination.
I think the plague was unprecedented in the scope of its mortality, and I'm of the opinion that the mortality was higher than most scholars are willing to accept. I believe that the average mortality was close to 50%, not a third or 30% as most scholars claim.
Urban centers and religious communities have suffered most. 60% of Venice has been swept away in the epidemic. In Avignon, half the citizens are dead. At the monastery in Montpellier, where Guy de Chaliac received his training, only 7 of the 140 original monks are left. England is reported to have lost fully 2 million souls, a third of its total population. But Edward III, King of England, survives, as do other nobles who've taken shelter on secluded country estates.
There's a somewhat lesser death rate among the upper classes, partly because they could move. They could leave an urban area, they could leave a town, they could go out. Their castles or their manor houses might provide an environment that was a little less conducive to the contagious nature of plague.
Pope Clement VI, who deserts Avignon during the worst outbreak, is also alive and well. More amazing is the recovery of his surgeon, Guy de Chaliac. His journals record his words.
Towards the end of the plague, I developed a fever with a swelling in the groin. I was ill near on 6 weeks. When the swelling had ripened, I treated it with figs and cooked onions mixed with yeast and butter. I escaped by God's grace.
Oh, c'est un miracle, mon ami. Il faut que nous allons prier.
But for many, survival comes with a terrible cost. Having lost so much, they question whether life is still worth living. Ibn Khaldun, a 14th century Arab historian, fears that evil times are ahead.
The plague swallowed up many of the good things of civilization and wiped them out. The entire world changed.
Think about the impact of losing 15 million people, what that does to society, what that must have done to the church, what that must have done to science, to medicine, to art, to literature. What if you lost a Da Vinci in there? What if you lost a Leonardo? What if you lost a Michelangelo because of the Black Death?
You can look almost anywhere and see the traces of this loss of a third, a half of humanity. Well, I read one tombstone that said he died in the year when scarcely a quarter of humanity was left on Earth. This sense that you're part of a fragment, 25% remaining, that's it.
This is the only time in recorded history that every single person in the known world, without exception, has watched their closest loved ones die in agony. The sorrow and isolation devastate the Italian poet Petrarch.
Consider what we were and what we are. Where are our dear friends now? Where are the beloved faces? There was a crowd of us. Now we are almost alone.
But for some, rather than sorrow, the plague brings the opportunity for looting, drinking, and brutality. In the empty houses of the dead, wild excesses overflow.
Giù le mani da lei! Quella è la mia donna! Maiale!
Florentine historian Matteo Villani is outraged.
Men gave themselves to the most disordered and sordid behavior more than ever before. They rushed headlong into lust.
Still, the vast majority of survivors neither sink into despair nor wallow in excess. Most simply pick up and get on with the process of living. They never lose faith in God, or, even more remarkably, their faith in the future.
Medieval people also had the assumption that God would make all things right, that God had a plan, that the apocalypse would set things right in the end, or that there would be a renewal, a restoration, that this was not simply the end, there would be something that would come beyond.
What's amazing in a way is how quickly these societies renormalized, re-routinized, became functioning societies again.
Their faith makes it possible for medieval people to not just survive, but actually go forth and multiply, according to French chronicler Jean de Venette.
When the epidemic was over, the men and women still alive married each other. Everywhere, women conceived more readily than usual.
The pause in violence will be unbearably brief. For even as society tries to heal itself, chaos erupts once more. The old mold has been smashed, and the new one will be shaped at the point of a sword. In all of human history, only a few events are watershed moments, when everything can be identified as either coming before or after. The Black Death is one of these.
When in European history has there ever been an event where possibly 50% of the entire population died in such a quick time? It's an event like this which we can barely wrap our minds around. How is it that you can wake up one morning and be dead by the evening?
The heart-sick survivors have no choice but to go forward, for pain and loss have shattered the past.
I've often wondered whether the sense of despair and the sense of irrationality with regard to what has happened opened up minds to questioning authority, but questioning how we understand God, and questioning to what degree there is an authority that we can all turn to.
The plague cracks the church's 1,000-year-old stranglehold on religion. Many nobles decide to take their faith into their own hands.
Some families began to hire private chaplains, so that there seems to be a kind of privatizing of religion that takes place.
While the plague turns some survivors closer to God, others look for new answers in science. In Avignon, France, plague survivor Guy de Chaliac is driven to write his masterpiece, the Chirurgia Magna, or Great Surgery. The authoritative text of Western medicine for the next 300 years. He bases it not on ancient philosophy and astrology, but upon his own first-hand observations of disease.
The plague had an important impact in the practice of medicine, because when the plague arrived, the university-trained physician was basically an internist and didn't do any clinical medicine. His knowledge of medicine was all theoretical. After the debacle of the plague, medicine became increasingly more practical.
In the Italian countryside, another transformation is taking place. Prior to the plague, famine is common. Though every inch of land is sowed, supply never catches up to the soaring demand. Now, even with much of the land gone fallow, there is food to spare. For the first time in centuries, farmers can grow not just grain, but luxury crops. And so, Italy becomes a country rich in olive oil and fragrant fruit.
Francesco, vieni giù ad aiutare! Non posso fare tutto da solo.
Sì, papà.
Italy's orchards underline a grisly fact. A sudden drop in population has its advantages.
As people died, wages rose. And as people died and lands were vacated, people who in the past were relatively poor could afford to begin to invest in land.
And what that meant was that all of a sudden people who had been peasants were now what we might call kulak class. They were now landowners. They had decent-sized farms, and they could actually live independent lives rather than working the fields of others.
One of the interesting things is to look at the diet. Their diet, which is almost strictly grain-fed diet, ale, bread pudding, bread, now has quite a bit of meat in it, has some vegetables in it.
La cena è pronta.
Andiamo, figli.
But as the fortunes of peasants rise, the lot of the ruling class plummets. For centuries, nobles have depended on serfs to work the estates. Now, with better jobs drawing peasants elsewhere, nobles are left without a labor force, forcing them to gather their own bitter harvest. A clergyman gleefully notes how the mighty have fallen.
Churchmen, knights, and other worthies have been forced to thresh their corn, plow their land, and perform every other unskilled task, if they are to make their own bread.
Ma che stai facendo? Ma come la stai usando quella zappa?
Marito mio, giuro che te la faccio mangiare questa
Ma guarda
pala.
come stai zappando, se la usassi bene, non staremo qua tutto il giorno.
Many impoverished nobles refuse to lower themselves to farm work. Instead, they seek their fortune the old-fashioned way, at the point of a sword.
You have a lot of military types running around. Sometimes they're employed by France or England or Spain or Catalonia or someone, in which case they're drawing a salary and looting cities for pay. Sometimes they're unemployed and they're looting cities to feed themselves.
To make up for the shrinking size of their armies, knights create new rules for an old game. Guerrilla warfare is born, and worse.
You have all these demilitarized men roaming the land, looking for opportunities to pillage. And that's really where things like scalping, for example, come from. It was the terror tactics of these groups of military men seeking to extort from villagers and from city folk.
The repercussions of a smaller workforce ripple into the more peaceful pursuits of commerce and industry as well.
Simply, the destruction of so many people forced the survivors to come up with labor-saving devices such as the printing press.
Industries that used to rely heavily on surplus manual labor, like the cloth industry, which used to be able to count on lots of dislocated peasants who didn't have land because there were so many people and the land was fixed. They can't rely on that labor, so they start to turn to other kinds of solutions, technological solutions, like mills.
Less than a century after the Black Death, the fabulous illuminated manuscripts of the Middle Ages become relics. Gutenberg's printing press has put them out of business.
All the industries that we really associate with later processes of industrialization start to emerge in the late 14th century, and you could argue that they emerge partly as a response to the labor crisis precipitated by the plague.
Still, the greatest impact of the plague is not in the battlefields or factories, but in the human heart.
I can't even imagine the anguish that would have occurred from a parent or a child watching a parent get sick. Take young people who may have seen their parents die, surviving in the 1350s, but with that memory of death all around them, so that death became a common sight.
I think there is lots of evidence that there was a psychological transformation affected by the plague and by the sudden dramatic disappearance of so many people.
Death clings to their imaginations like a menacing shadow and creeps into the late medieval art known as danse macabre.
The kind of Dutch paintings you see with skeletons dancing and with a kind of memento mori, just remember death. Death is everywhere.
In time, the social upheaval of the post-plague years, the questioning attitudes and increased individualism all lead to the greatest flowering of culture and knowledge in European history: the Renaissance. The Renaissance in Italy shows the extraordinary resilience of human society, a tenacity and creative energy that sustained it through the plague's darkest years.
It was as if Europe had suddenly switched off and then back on again. And the Black Death had done that.
But today, many scientists wonder how well modern society would emerge from a similar cataclysm. For killer microbes still exist in remote regions, waiting for a host to take them to our modern population centers. Between 1347 and 1350, nearly half of the population of the known world perishes. Nothing before or since. No earthquake, no war, no weapon of mass destruction has ever caused such mortality.
The ultimate enemy are microbes. And man has no reason to think that because of his superior intellect, if it really came down to a battle, he would necessarily win.
Surprisingly, the microbe that causes bubonic plague still exists in our world today. In Saudi Arabia, North and South Africa, parts of South America, and the United States. In 1900, the microbe hitches a ride from its perennial breeding grounds in China aboard merchant ships to California, spawning an outbreak of bubonic plague in the United States. From the West Coast, it travels inland, where it finds a fertile new host population, the rodent communities of America's deserts and grasslands.
It's in the southwestern part of the United States: Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, California, some in Texas, Arizona. It's mainly in ground squirrels, chipmunks, prairie dogs, small rodent animals. It can infect other animals, and particularly cats.
Cats, like humans, are very, very susceptible to plague, and they can develop plague pneumonia with cough. And they can spread the disease then to people. If the pet owner is handling the cat, has the cat up in their face, and the cat's coughing, they can get what we call primary pneumonic plague, which is acquired by inhaling the bacteria.
When the Black Death ravages the people of the 14th century, the only effective treatment seems to be a miracle. Now, antibiotics can cure bubonic plague, if the case is identified early enough.
tracing contacts, looking for whoever might have been in contact with this person might have been exposed. And then quite often these people get prophylactic antibiotics to make sure the disease doesn't spread.
Yersinia pestis, the microbe that causes bubonic plague, is well known and understood. What worries disease watchers are the unknown microscopic killers, diseases poised to emerge and spread through modern populations.
Things entering into the food chain, things changing hosts that you'd never dreamed would change hosts, things appearing in unlikely areas.
AIDS, SARS, valley fever, avian flu, and Lyme disease all appear in modern populations simply because things change. Microbes are given an opportunity, and they take it.
Lyme disease really was let loose because suburban forests in the Northeast were being cleared for suburban sprawl. So it's the same phenomenon. I mean, we're doing that today. We don't know what agents we're going to let loose.
What if Ebola virus established a new home in the East Coast of the United States? That could be pretty awful. It's untreatable. It's unfortunately spread from patients to caretakers. It's the family taking care of them, the doctors, the nurses that come down with that disease. And it's a very frightening disease in that respect.
In medieval times, the Black Death comes from a remote area and then spreads along trade routes to the entire civilized world with startling speed. Microbes traveling now can go much further and far faster.
When you think of the 24-hour period of travel, you realize that any virus in the world, anywhere, can be right here in this living room within one incubation period. Doesn't have to transmit to anybody, doesn't have to go through a fleet, doesn't have to do anything.
Looking at the plague, there are a couple of things that jump out that parallel our situation. You have the notion of an expanding economy, new trade routes.
You realize that 500 million people every year cross international borders on international airline flights. 500 million a year. 70 million work outside their own country. I mean, the numbers are just staggering of the amount of movement, the speed of that movement, and the density of the humans. Put that together, it's a setup.
Hampered by religion and superstition, medieval scientists like Guy de Chauliac are hopelessly unprepared for the Black Death. Many experts fear that when confronted with a catastrophic epidemic, modern science will be equally surprised.
If you took something like the plague of the 14th century, where people are dying in their homes, in the streets, and all over the place, I'm not sure we'd handle it. I hope we'd handle it better, but I'm not sure we'd handle it terribly much better than the people of the medieval period did. We don't have a lot of redundancy in the system. We don't have surge capacity, as they call it. If something goes wrong, you know, the capacity is not there to really handle it.
There's absolutely no way that organised health systems could cope with an epidemic of the proportions of the Black Plague.
In the end, history can only tell us what has come before. Terror and violence. Heroism and self-sacrifice. Restoration and renewal. These are the legacies of the Black Death.
The plague is a kind of mirror in which we can actually see how a society coped with a clear medical human disaster.
When that mirror is held up to our own times, the vision is cloudy and troubling. For man's ultimate enemy is still out there somewhere, no less deadly than it was 650 years ago. That it will awaken is certain. That we will be ready is not.